All right. We are in textual criticism. And when I was in seminary, this was something that really fascinated me because I didn't know much about it before. And when I came to learn how we actually got our New Testament, it was eye-opening, and and I found it really super interesting. And I hope that you will too. It's not something that a lot of people are familiar with. Let me ask you, how many of you went to Bible college? Can I see your hands? Just put up your hand. Okay, one, two. Oh, many of you did not. Okay, of those of you who went to Bible college, how many of you studied textual criticism? One person? Looks like one person. Um, I asked my students, what did you study in Bible college? And uh, I end up wondering, what did you study in Bible college? I mean, um, this is something that's important, and there are a lot of things that are important, but it seems like somehow our Bible colleges don't teach them. Okay, last time we talked about how an original autograph, the original document was made, and then people made copies of those, and how as the years went by, many copies came into being. Now, there are four basic kinds of manuscripts, and the first is papyri. Uh, these are the oldest, and they're called papyri because they're made on papyrus. Papyri is the plural for papyrus. Papyrus manuscripts are designated by a German P with a superscript number, like, for example, P46. And we'll show you that kind of script in just a minute. The only New Testament books that we don't have on papyrus are 1st and 2nd Timothy. Everything else we have at least one papyrus manuscript of. So these are the oldest. Next, we have uncial or majuscule manuscripts. These always used to be called uncial, and then for some reason, I'm not sure why, they've started calling them majuscule. This refers to the kind of letters that are used to write the manuscript. There's only one uncial manuscript that contains the entire New Testament, and that is Codex Sinaiticus, and it preserves the entire New Testament. Uncial manuscripts are designated by a capital letter like A or B, or one of them uses the Hebrew letter Aleph, or a number beginning with 0. So we only have 26 letters in the Latin alphabet. So when you get more than 26 manuscripts, you have to do something else. So they are also designated by a number preceded by a 0. We should point out the fact that papyrus manuscripts are written with uncial characters. The script is uncial, but we don't call them uncial. We call them papyri because of the kind of material that they're written on. Okay, so far we have two kinds of manuscripts, papyri and uncial. And this is a picture of an uncial manuscript or a majuscule manuscript. And here is another one. This is Matthew 1, 1-3 in Codex Vaticanus, Codex B. The next kind of manuscript is minuscule manuscripts. This also refers to the kind of handwriting that is used to write these manuscripts. It began in the 9th century, okay? Minuscule writing began in the 9th century, and it was used until the 15th century. Minuscule manuscripts are designated by just a number, no zero in front like the uncials. And here is a picture of a minuscule manuscript. And here is another one, manuscript 9 from the 12th century. Now here is Matthew 1, 1 to 3a in a minuscule script. You can tell this is much more complicated than the uncial. Uncials are nice square letters. This is more like handwriting, like, what is the term? Handwriting, script, I guess you would say. So here is a comparison. You see the top is uncial and the bottom is minuscule of the same text. So it's much easier to read the top one than it is the bottom one. Okay, so we've looked at three kinds: papyri, uncial or majuscule, and minuscules. And then we have lectionaries. These were scripture passages used in the worship of the church. Now, many churches today, if you go in, you will see the scriptures written out on a bulletin. Well, that's sort of the way it was with the lectionaries. They would use those in their worship services. The lectionaries date from the 8th to the 16th century, and they are designated by a cursive L followed by a number. So the papyri are the oldest. The uncials are from the 4th to 10th centuries. The minuscules are from the 9th century and later. And the lectionaries are from around the 8th century and later. As of 1976, there were 5,366 manuscripts that had been found. Of them, excuse me, we got somebody to come in. Of them, 88 were papyri. This is going back quite a few years, but if we want to break it down, 88 of those were papyri. Notice we have three columns: the kind of manuscripts, how many are in uncial script, and how many are in minuscule script. The papyri, all 88, are in uncial script. When we come to the uncial manuscripts, again, all of those are in uncial script, 274 in 1976. The minuscule manuscripts are all in minuscule script. The lectionaries are divided. Some of the older ones are in uncial characters, and the later ones are in minuscules. So if you look at the totals here, in 1976, we had 607 uncial script manuscripts, and we had 4,759 minuscule script manuscripts. Okay, that's just a numbers breakdown. As of 2011, it broke down this way. There were 127 papyri, 322 uncials, 2,910 minuscules, and 2,453 lectionaries, for a total of 5,812 manuscripts. Now, as of this month, the number is now 5,916, but I don't have a breakdown of what kind they are. That's a huge number of manuscripts. If you compare this to other ancient documents, this is just, it's been called an embarrassment of wealth. You know, some of the major documents from the ancient world, there may only be 10 manuscripts. or less. And look at all of these. We have so many. The oldest manuscript that we have is called P52. Now look at the bottom of the screen on the left. You see that funny looking character there? That is a German P. And then in superscript is 52. So that is how papyri are designated. This is papyrus 52. It comes from around the year 125. And the passage that we have, you'll notice that this is two sides of one scrap of manuscript. It's John 18:31 to 33 on one side and verses 37 to 38 on the other side. So that is Greek manuscripts. This is an important documents on understanding how we got our New Testament. There's other textual evidence, though. We have versions. The New Testament texts were translated into other languages. Some of these versions are of very early date. And so by translating them from whatever language it's in back into Greek, you can see how that reading was in the Greek. The major languages for this are Latin, Syriac, and Coptic. But there are also manuscripts in Armenian, Georgian, Gothic, Ethiopic, and Old Church Slavonic. So we have versions. We also have what we call patristic citations. These are the writings of the early church fathers, such as Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, Cyprian, the church fathers. They would quote the New Testament, and we can see what their manuscript, how it read, by looking at what they say in their writings. In fact, if all the copies of the New Testament disappeared, we could still recreate almost all of it simply from the citations of the church fathers, where the church fathers quote the New Testament. In times of economic depression, parchment was reused. The older script was scraped off or washed off, and then something new would be put on it, written over the old. A book like this is called a palimpsest. An example of this would be Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. It originally was written in the 5th century, and then in the 12th century, somebody erased it and wrote the sermons of St. Ephraim on top. But by using ultraviolet light, we are able to go back and read the original. Of all the manuscripts today, 68 of them, of the uncials, are palimpsests. Sometimes scribes wrote notes at the end of their books. An Armenian manuscript says that a heavy snowstorm was raging outside. The ink froze, the scribe's hands became numb, and his pen fell from his fingers. Just a note there that the scribe put in at the end of his manuscript. There are other notes. Let me just read you a few. As the travelers rejoice to see their home country, so also is the end of a book to those who toil. He must have gotten really tired writing that manuscript. The end of the book, thanks be to God. Whoever says, God bless the soul of the scribe, God will bless his soul. And mercy be to him who wrote, O Lord, wisdom to those who read, grace to those who hear, salvation to those who own. Amen. Now, sometimes copyists would write notes in the margins of their manuscripts. If they were monks, Catholic monks, they were probably sworn to silence, took an oath of silence, so they couldn't talk, but they could write notes. And so we have conversational jottings at times in the margins of manuscripts. Here is from a 9th century Latin manuscript, and in the margin there are notes in Irish. And the notes say, it's cold today. It is natural, it is winter. The lamp gives bad light. It is time for us to begin to do some work. Well, this vellum is certainly heavy. Well, I call this vellum thin. I feel dull today. I don't know what is wrong with me. I find that stuff really interesting. You know, in the 9th century, these scribes are writing to each other in the margins of the manuscripts. That will not be on the test, however. In Hebrews 1:3, the original of Codex Vaticanus, Codex B, had the word phaneron, meaning manifesting. Okay, Hebrews 1:3. The corrector changed it to what is the better reading, pharon, meaning upholding or carrying along. A later scribe changed it back and wrote in the margin, most ignorant and wicked man, leave the original reading alone. Do not change it. Now here is Greenlee's graphic of the 4 different factors in textual transmission. First of all, the material. At the top there, we have papyrus, and then going to vellum, and then to paper. Under the pen, the next one, we start out with the reed, and then we go to the quill. In the book form, starts off in the scroll or the roll there at the beginning, and then from then on, it is the codex. And then the handwriting, it starts off with uncial, and then it goes at the 9th to 10th century to the minuscule. Okay, let me just pause. Do you have any questions or comments here before we go on?
Doctor, I just want to ask, on the textual transmission, is there a criteria that they need to follow, and how accurate? Sorry.
Well, they should be as accurate as possible. And I believe that most of the scribes wanted to be as accurate as possible. The criterion, well, I think I'll answer that question when we go on and ask the question, how do we know which is the best manuscript? Okay. Now, at times, scribes would intentionally change. I would say it's rather rare, but on occasion, a scribe would intentionally change a manuscript, and we'll look at that in a minute. Any other questions or comments? All right. Let us just look at the major manuscripts. We will not take a lot of time on this, but so that you can just be familiar with what some of the major ones are. The papyri. These would be considered the major papyrus manuscripts. P4, 64, and 67. These 3 may actually be from the same manuscript. However, they are in different locations now. They are from the mid to late 200s. Uh, P11, this was the first papyrus manuscript ever published by textual critics, and it was published by Tischendorf in 1868. P45 is from the early 200s, and it's one of the largest gospel papyri that we have. P46, this is 86 leaves of Paul's epistles, a very important manuscript. It is early, around 8200. And then P52 that we mentioned before, the oldest manuscript that we have right now. Now about P52, we only have, remember, we only have a small fragment there, that passage in John. And about that, Metzger and Ehrman say this. You might be thinking, hey, it's only a little scrap. How is that significant? Well, this is what they say. Although the extent of the verses preserved is so slight, in one respect, this tiny scrap of papyrus possesses quite as much evidential value as would the complete codex. Just as Robinson Crusoe, seeing but a single footprint in the sand, concluded that another human being with 2 feet was present on the island with him, so P52 proves the existence and use of the fourth gospel during the first half of the 2nd century in a provincial town along the Nile, far removed from its traditional place of composition, Ephesus in Asia. Okay, I don't know if you know the story of Robinson Crusoe, but he is shipwrecked, and it's on a small island, and he thinks he's all alone, but he comes across some footprints. And what they're saying here is that those footprints show that there was a whole person, not just feet, a whole person was there. And the same thing with this little papyrus. It shows that within a short period of time, this papyrus, this copy of John's gospel, had gone to a place far away up the Nile in Egypt and was being used there. They say, had this little fragment been known during the middle of the past 19th century, that school of New Testament criticism, which was inspired by the brilliant Tübingen professor Ferdinand Christian Bauer, could not have argued that the fourth gospel was not composed until the year 160. So understanding, this helps us in our evaluation of when the New Testament documents were written. And then we have P66, which is, it contains the Gospels from around the year 200, and P75, which is the earliest manuscript of the Gospel of Luke, again, from the late 100s or the early 200s. So these are the major papyrus manuscripts. The major uncial manuscripts, we'll only mention 3. Codex Sinaiticus, designated by the Hebrew Aleph or the number 01. It's our only complete uncial manuscript of the entire New Testament. And at one time, it also had the entire Old Testament as well. The story of its acquisition is fascinating. Count Tischendorf went to a monastery at Mount Sinai, and there he found this codex. He noticed that the monks there were using its pages to burn in their fireplace to keep warm. And he got it, maybe through some deception or whatever. He got it away from them so he could preserve it. It was purchased by the Russian government, and then it was later purchased for £100,000 by the British Museum. The second one is Codex Alexandrinus, designated by A or O2. It is a beautiful manuscript from the 400s. And then we have the Uncial Codex Vaticanus, B, O3, and this also at one time contained the entire Old and New Testaments, but now there are pages missing from both of those. It's been in the Vatican since at least the 1400s. And two of the pioneers of textual criticism, Westcott and Hort, valued this manuscript over everything else. All right, let's look at the manuscript families, or it's also called text types. There are certain manuscripts that tend to be very much alike. So we can say they come in families. And these are the major families. There are 3, possibly 4 families. The first is the Alexandrian family, or it's also called the neutral family. And it's generally considered to be the best manuscripts that we have. It comes from Egypt. They tended to be very meticulous, very careful in their copying of the manuscripts. This family can be traced back to the 2nd century. We then have the Western family. And the Western family comes primarily from Northern Africa, Italy, and France, although there are some of them that are in the East. It contains some unusual readings, paraphrases, and additions. In fact, the Western version of the Book of Acts is 10% longer than the standard or the Alexandrian manuscripts. Does this mean then that we should not accept any Western text? Well, it doesn't. There are some times when it seems like the Western text may be the original. We then have the Byzantine text type. This text type originates later. It comes from the area of Constantinople. It is very smooth. They have taken out the rough edges of the grammar. And so they're very smooth, easy reading, and but they're not as good as the Alexandrian family. Now, there are people today who say that the Byzantine is the best. There are more Byzantine manuscripts than any other. And so it must be the best. It must be what God wanted us to be using. Well, no, that logic doesn't hold. You can't just count the number of manuscripts and say, well, that was the original. But we'll look in just a minute at how we do determine which is the original. Some people believe that there is a Caesarean text type in the Gospels only, sort of a combination between Alexandrian and Western. Some people say, no, it doesn't really exist. Here is a map of the textual traditions. So you'll see the Western text on the left, Byzantine text on the top. We have a Syriac text in this illustration, Caesarean text, Alexandrian text. There's some problems with this in that what if a scribe has two texts, and one is, let's say, a Western text, and one is an Alexandrian text. And he's using both to make his copy. His copy is going to be a mixture of those two text types. More and more, textual critics are really, you may say, turning their back on this idea of the families. Now, when textual criticism began, this was very, very important. But in recent years, its importance has diminished. The important thing for us is that when copies were made, changes crept in. Okay, what kind of changes? Well, I tell you what. Let me just pause and see if you have any questions or comments here on the major manuscripts, or on the textual families, or anything else on textual criticism.
Yes, Dr. Maskin.
Mm-hmm.
In the map, there are 5 different families, or it is someone's on overlaps.
Yeah,
We
it's
haven't.
it's a subjective kind of thing, you know. Whoever made this map thought that there was a 5th kind of text type, Syriac,
Okay,
and yeah, it's
this is not relevant.
no.
Okay.
Yeah. Any other questions?
So
Yes.
can I go back to when you were talking about the patristic writing from the church fathers, the early church fathers, and you said if the New Testament scriptures or manuscript were all lost, we can still recover. How inspired were they? I mean, how were their writings really, really close to the original manuscript? You know how we know that they were inspired by the Spirit to write the New Testament writings. I mean,
Yeah, the church fathers were not inspired the way the New Testament writers were. So their value is their text. So we would apply textual criticism to what they wrote the same as we would with Greek manuscripts. So it's not a matter of inspiration, but we can gain from that what their text was. Just like today, if you have a copy of the NIV, you know, the committee that put the NIV together was not inspired, but those original writings were inspired. And so the value of the NIV is that it is the inspired word of God, even though the committee that put it together was not inspired. Okay, and then we compare that to the ESV. Well, the people who put that together weren't inspired, but the text was inspired. So the value of the church fathers is, can we discern what the text was that they were using? And they were very early, you know, in terms of history. So they are valuable on that score.
thank you, Dr.
Okay. Other questions, comments? All right. Let's look at the kind of errors that crept in to the manuscripts, mistaking one letter for another. For example, in 2 Peter 2:13, is the word agapais, love feasts, or is it apatais, dissipation? They look very similar. And when a scribe looked at those, they could get them mixed up. So mistaking one letter for another would be something that would be a problem. So the King James, the Living Bible, Today's English version, NIV, Jerusalem Bible, all translate it as if it was agapais. But the RSV, the New English Bible, and Phillips translates it as if it was apatais, or dissipation or deceptions. We have that occurring in other places in the New Testament as well. So that's one kind of error, mistaking one letter for another. Faulty use of abbreviations. There came to be 15 standard abbreviations that were used in the copying of the New Testament. And these are called the nomina sacra, the 15 abbreviations. But one scribe might use an abbreviation that another scribe is not familiar with, or he may not be able to read it correctly. Here is Uncial manuscript G from the 9th century, 1 Corinthians 2, 9 through 3:3. Now you'll notice that this is an interlinear manuscript. It's written in Greek, but it has Latin, the Latin translation over each word. Also notice that at the bottom of the page, there is another thing written. It's not part of the text. And this is what it says. It's written in Irish, and it says, to come to Rome, much of trouble, little of profit. The thing thou seekest here, if thou bring it not with thee, thou findest not. Great folly, great madness, great ruin of sense, great insanity, since thou hast set out for death, that thou shouldst be in disobedience to the Son of Mary. Now, I don't know what that scribe was thinking, but it sounds like he's thinking, don't come to Rome, stay away. And if you think you're going to find in Rome, you think you're going to fill that hole in your heart with something that you're going to find in Rome, you're not going to find it. And the thing thou seekest here, if thou bring it not with thee, thou findest not. Hey, I think that there's probably some good theology in that. People travel all over the world trying to fill that hole in their heart, and only one thing can fill that hole in their heart, and that is Jesus. Now, here is a close-up of the abbreviations. On the top one, you have a theta and what looks like a C. It looks like an O with a line through it and a C. That is the standard abbreviation for theos, or God. The bottom one is an A-N omega N, anthropon. That is the abbreviation for man. Homonym is the Latin right above it. So that's an example of abbreviations. Thirdly, skipping lines. Homeotetulon. And we've all done that, haven't we? When we've copied things. It's very easy to skip a line. Repeating something that you've just written, putting it in twice. I saw that in something online this week, and they should have caught it, but they didn't. Omission, haplography, skipping over something, leaving out a word. That is very easy to do. Errors of the ear. You hear it, but you don't really understand what they're saying, or you mishear it. For example, when I was much younger, we used to sing a chorus that went, trust, it was I believe God. It went, I believe God, it shall be done even as he said. Trust and obey, believe him and say, I believe God. Now, that's a nice chorus, isn't it? Trust and obey. You know, we trust and obey God. We believe him, and then we will say, I believe God. But, you know, you could hear it this way. Trust and oh, baby, leave him and say. Trust and oh, baby, leave him and say, right? It sounds exactly the same, but it's misinterpreted. See, this is an error of the ear, how we understand things. Let me give you another illustration. I'm going to play a video for you. And this video is President George W. Bush speaking with his Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. Now, this is, of course, American, and Bush was in office quite a few years ago now. And there are some words there that they get mixed up. One of them is who, the leader of China. And they get that mixed up with WHO, who. Yes, sir. They get mixed up with Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian leader. And Kofi Annan, the leader of the United Nations at that time. They get that mixed up with coffee. So we have Yasser, we have yes, sir for Yasser, we have who for who, and we have Kofi for coffee. Anyway, let me play this for you.
Mr. President, Condoleezza Rice is here to see you.
Good, send her in.
Yes, sir. Good morning, Mr. President.
Oh, Condoleezza, nice to see you. What's happening?
Well, Mr. President, I have the report here about the new leader in China.
Great, Condi, lay it on me.
Mr. President, who is the new leader of China?
Well, that's what I want to know.
Well, that's what I'm telling you, Mr. President.
Well, that's what I'm asking you, Condi. Who is the new leader of China?
Yes.
I mean the feller's name.
Hugh.
The guy in China.
Hugh.
The new leader of China.
Hugh.
The Chinaman.
Hugh is leading China, Mr. President.
What are you asking me for?
I'm telling you, Hugh is leading China.
Well, I'm asking you, Condi, who is leading China?
That's the man's name.
That's whose name?
Yes.
Will you or will you not tell me the name of the new leader of China?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Arafat is in China. I thought he was in the Middle East.
That's correct, sir.
Then who's in China?
Yes, sir.
Yasser's in China?
No, sir.
Then who is?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir?
No, sir.
Connie, you're starting to piss me off now, and it's not because you're black neither. I need to know the name of the new leader of China, so I want you to get me the Secretary General of the United Nations on the phone.
Coffee, Annan?
No, thanks. And Condi, call me George. Stop with that Ebonics crap.
You want coffee?
No.
You don't want coffee?
No, but now you mention it, I could use a glass of milk. And then get me the UN.
Yes, sir.
Not Yasser, the guy at the United Nations.
Coffee.
Milk! Will you please make that call?
And call who?
Well, who's the guy at the UN?
No, who is the guy in China?
Will you stay out of China?
Yes, sir.
And stay out of the Middle East. Just get me the guy at the UN.
Coffee.
All right, with cream and 2 sugars. Now get on the phone.
Hello. Rice here.
Rice, good idea. And get a couple of egg rolls too, Condi. Maybe we should send some to the guy in China and the Middle East. Can you get Chinese food in the Middle East? I don't know.
Okay. Sorry that the sound and the video didn't go very well together. I think it's this computer that I'm using. But that is an example of hearing something but mishearing it. So the same thing happened in the giving of manuscripts. Someone would speak and the scribe could misunderstand, even though he hears what is said, but he doesn't interpret it correctly. Okay? Okay, We have this kind of thing in Romans 5:1. Is it ekomen, which means let us have, or is it ekomen, meaning we have? They both sound just pretty much exactly the same. And so if I would say one of those, which one would you write down? In Koine Greek, several letters and diphthongs were pronounced alike. E, I, U, EI, OI, UI, and long E all were pronounced like a long E, so the E sound. Because of that, very often, the words for us or we, humes, and you, hemes is we or us, you is humes, those are mixed up. For example, in 1 John 1:4, did John say, we write to make our joy complete? That is hemon, or your joy complete, humon? Well, they probably would have sounded exactly alike to the scribe. And so when you look at the manuscript evidence, it's divided between the two. All right, it's time for a break, and we will take a 10-minute break and come back after that. All right. More than 10 minutes. I apologize. Oh, it says Zoom quit. Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I
Okay.
can hear you.
Yes.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Okay, let us go on. Errors of memory. And here we deal with a sequence of words. We read something and then we have to remember the sequence of words to write it down. Is it baptized by him in the Jordan River or baptized in the Jordan River by him? For example, in Mark 1:5. Errors of judgment. In John 5:3b to 4, there's the story of the pool of Bethesda and the mention of the angel troubling the waters. And that probably was a marginal notation by someone that got into some of the manuscripts. The worst error of judgment that I am familiar with comes from Luke 3:23 to 38. And one scribe copied a 2-column manuscript of Luke's genealogy of Jesus as if it was a 1-column manuscript. So instead of 2 columns, he just read it right across as if it were 1 column. In it, God was the son of Aram, and Phares was the father of all mankind. Now that is a pretty bad error, I would say. I would have thought that he would have picked that up. And then we have the faulty division of words. Since in the Greek manuscripts, the uncial manuscripts, there was no separation between the words, you would need to decide where those words should be divided. Look at this. What does this say? Somebody tell me.
Yeah. Yes, doctor.
Yes, Usero, what does this say?
Miles.
Miles, sorry.
Yeah. It says there, I saw abundance on the table.
I saw abundance on the table. Is that what it
Yeah,
says?
if you just break it, but it's in one, one
Okay.
sense, yeah.
Okay. What else could it say if you divide the words differently? Anybody see any other possibilities? How about I saw a bun
Okay,
dance on the table?
another one. Yes, doctor.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Here, it says as well, is a wab, is a wabu dance on the table? Is there somebody dancing on the table?
Yeah, I don't think those are words, some of them. But yeah, you could say, I saw abundance on the table, which is what most of you read. But you could also say, I saw a bun dance on the table.
Okay.
A bun, a piece of bread, okay? So that's an illustration of how do we divide the words? We see the words, but how do we divide them? What does this say?
God is now here.
God is now here. All right. How else could it read?
Yeah.
God is
It says
nowhere.
also, yeah, God is nowhere.
God is nowhere. So if you're a Christian, it's God is now here. If you're an atheist, it's God is nowhere. All right. Now, some examples from the Bible. 1 Timothy 3:16. Homologumen hos mega. We acknowledge how great. ESV reads this, indeed, we confess. A great indeed, we confess, is the mystery of godliness. Or it could be homolegumenos mega, confessedly great. So we have the NIV, beyond all question, the mystery from true godliness springs, from which true godliness springs is great. So it could be either one, depending on how you divide the words. Is hos a second word, or is it part of the first word? Another example is Mark 10:40. The NIV says, these places belong to those for whom they have been prepared. And as you see here, if it's 3 words there, that is the way you would translate it. But if it's only 2 words, it would be translated, it has been prepared for others. Alois is others. It has been prepared. So that was an issue there. Okay, these are unintentional changes, just changes that a scribe would unintentionally make. But there were also intentional changes. And let's just look at some of those. Supposed corrections of misspellings. So if a scribe comes across a word that is what he thinks is misspelled, and he changes it to correct it, as a proofreader, that changes the manuscript then. Grammatical corrections to make them more literary. For example, in Revelation 1:4, grace and peace to you from him who is and was and is to come. The phrase that is there, who is and who was and who is to come, is technically in the wrong case. It should be a genitive, but it's a nominative, if you know Greek parlance. It was probably intentional that way by the author. And some later scribes corrected it back to what technically should be right according to Greek grammar. Changes to remove historical difficulties. You might look at Paul's conversion recorded in Acts. It's recorded in 3 different places, and it's a little different each time. And so a scribe would remember how it was before and want to change it. Harmonistic corruptions. For example, in Luke 23:38, some scribes brought in what we have in John about the sign over Jesus' cross, written in Greek and Latin and Aramaic. They're what we call conflations of readings. If you have 2 manuscripts and one has one word and another has another word, a scribe wouldn't want to drop out either one, so they put in both. For example, in Luke 24:53, some manuscripts said, continuing in the temple, blessing God. Other manuscripts said, continuing in the temple, praising God. And then other manuscripts added both, continuing in the temple, blessing and praising God. So that's a conflation, putting together 2 different readings. And then we come to doctrinal alterations. An example of this is 1 John 5:7. There are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Spirit, and those 3 are one. That does not appear in the original manuscripts. In fact, it doesn't appear in any manuscripts until around the 6th century. And the way it got into our New Testament is that when Erasmus was putting together the first Greek New Testament to publish, he didn't include that part of 1 John 5:7. And the Catholics got onto him saying, you know, you left out an important doctrinal statement. And he said, well, if you can show me a Greek manuscript that has it, I will include it. Well, they showed him a Greek manuscript that had it after some time went by. And in fact, they probably made that Greek manuscript for that occasion. Erasmus included it in his Greek New Testament, and it made its way into the King James Version. And so it is there in the King James Version. Now, our doctrine of the Trinity doesn't depend upon that verse. And so we're not losing anything doctrinal when we realize that that part of the verse was not original. Marcion, the heretic of the 2nd century, got rid of a lot of scripture. He took off the whole Old Testament. His only gospel was Luke, and it was an edited version of that. And he edited 10 of the Pauline epistles for doctrinal reasons. All right. So as we go along, errors crept in to the manuscript tradition. We want the word as it was originally written. How do we do that? Well, we decide which manuscripts are original based on the evidence. And there are two kinds of evidence. The first is internal evidence. Internal evidence looks at the probability of what the author would write, knowing his other writings, his theology, and his circumstances. So if we look at a verse and we see something there that, wow, we just don't see how Paul would have written that, that may be a red flag in terms of which is the correct reading, if it conflicts with other readings on that. The second is external evidence, and it looks at the manuscripts that are available, their age, their quality, their genealogy, and so forth. Now, there are 4 approaches to textual criticism. The first is the classical method. This relies heavily on the families, the genealogical approach. So it puts a greater emphasis on the Alexandrian family, for example, and discounts the others. Westcott and Hort, in using this method, really liked manuscript B. In fact, in one place, manuscript B is the only manuscript that has a certain reading, and they chose that reading over all of the other manuscripts. So this adheres rigidly to the genealogical or the family approach. Next, we have reasoned eclecticism. This treats each passage on its own merits, taking into account the internal evidence as well as the external evidence. And then there is rigorous eclecticism, and this relies almost entirely on internal evidence. What would, for example, Paul, what would he say when you see divergences in the manuscripts? What is Paul likely to have said, or what would he never have said? And this pretty much ignores the different manuscripts and how valuable each manuscript is. And then the last one is the majority text method. This basically counts the number of manuscripts that has a certain reading. And the one with the most is taken as the correct reading. However, you may have thousands of manuscripts that have one reading, but they could all be wrong. So the majority text method is really not the best method to use. Now, the majority text method is used by a lot of people today. And you can go on to Facebook, and there is a Facebook page called NT Textual Criticism. And the people in that use the majority text method. They rely on the Byzantine manuscripts. And it's really a lot different from what I'm teaching you here. And I think we really need to avoid that. Which of these methods would you say is the best method to use? Which approach? Okay, the classical method. The classical method, depending on the families. Reasoned eclecticism, looking at both the internal and the external evidence. Rigorous eclecticism, depending almost entirely on internal evidence, or the majority text method, counting the numbers and see which has the most. Which of those do you think would be the best?
Yeah.
I think it's
Yeah.
number 2.
Yeah, reason, yes, right.
Reasoned
Yeah.
eclecticism?
Mhm.
Analyze a lot of sources.
What's that?
They analyze a lot of resources. before.
Okay. Yes. Number 2 would be our choice here. Reasoned eclecticism. Look at all the evidence and on the basis of that, make a decision.
Mm.
So how do we decide what the original text was? Well, textual criticism is as much an art as it is a science. One person has said that teaching a person to be a textual critic is like teaching a person to be a poet. So it takes good common sense as well as following a rigid procedure. So in light of that, I would like us to look at Greenlee's 4-step process. Number 1, study individual readings on the basis of intrinsic probability. Here, this is internal evidence. What is most likely for the author to have written? Then evaluate the individual witnesses, the individual manuscripts. And then determine the family groupings of the witnesses. And then return to the individual readings to confirm or revise your conclusions. So this is Greenlee's 4-step procedure on evaluating various variants of the text. Let's look at principles for choosing the best reading. Okay, all things being equal, which would be most accurate and valuable, an earlier manuscript or a later manuscript?
An earlier one.
Okay, an earlier manuscript would be more valuable because it's closer to the autograph, to the original writing. Okay, now I said all things being equal, and often all things are not equal, but if they were, the older, the better. So we want to work our way back to the original manuscripts. So the first principle here is the oldest reading is generally preferred. Secondly, the shortest reading is generally preferred if the change is intentional. Usually changes were made by way of addition. Normally, scribes would not want to intentionally leave something out of the text. So the shortest reading is generally preferred, and this applies to intentional changes. Thirdly, the hardest reading is generally preferred, again, if the change is intentional. Usually changes were made to smooth the reading out or to make it sound better, to remove difficulties. If something sounded unnatural to the scribe, he would change it to make it sound the way he thought it should. If it seems like it might disagree with another part of Scripture, then he might be tempted to change it to make it agree with that part of Scripture that he had already known about. So the hardest reading is generally preferred. You wouldn't intentionally change something that is nice and smooth to be a hard reading. And then finally, the reading that best explains the others is to be preferred. So this is the overall principle here. The reading that best explains the others is to be preferred. Now, no central Christian doctrine is in question because of a textual variant. All right? So when we do textual criticism, you know, the doctrine of the Trinity, for example, is not on the line. If we come up with the wrong thing there, it's not going to cause us to throw out the doctrine of the Trinity, or our Christology, or any other major doctrine. But what we want is to find the best text, the way it was originally written. Now, I want to give you an example. And this is something that was written by Dr. Jerry Camry Hoggett when he was a student in seminary under Gordon Fee. And you will find this on Moodle. It's an allegory on textual criticism. He's writing a letter to his aunt concerning a recipe for pie that is part of the family. So he says, "Dear Aunt Mahitabel, here's the copy of grandmother's recipe for apple pie you asked for. I had a devil of a time reconstructing it, and if you don't mind me saying so, you owe me one. As you remember, grandmother's original was lost when the old homestead burned in '48. If she hadn't let each of her girls make a copy, the recipe would have gone with her to the grave." So the autograph is gone. We no longer have the autograph. "Thought you might be interested in the steps I went through reconstructing it. The copy I have was given me by my mother. She used it so often that she rubbed out some of the instruction part, and water spots obliterated one or two of the ingredients. I checked my copy against the one Joyce had made that summer by the lake. She dictated it to me over the phone, and by reading it back, I was able to make certain I had it right. At one point, she said to cut in the shortening and butter, but I had heard batter and had to make the correction. See, that is an error of the ear. On hers, the instruction parts seemed to be complete, but she said her pies always turned out pasty in the middle and burned on the edges. So I took a real close look. Hers read, preheat oven to 450 degrees, bake pie 35 to 45 minutes until golden brown. Mine read, preheat oven to 450 degrees, bake pie 10 minutes, reduce oven to 350 degrees, bake pie 35 to 45 minutes until golden brown. It was obvious that she had dropped a line. I think I can even tell from that fact how the instructions must have been set up on grandmother's recipe card. So the first line was preheat oven to 450 degrees, bake pie. Second line, 10 minutes, reduce heat to 350 degrees, bake pie. Third line, 35 to 45 minutes until golden brown. The similarity between the first and second lines confused Joyce's eye, and as she refocused on the third, she skipped the second. So this is skipping lines. Homeotetuton. Teletuton, I'm sorry. Joyce made copies for all her kids and cousins, and they all have the same error. In fact, there are more copies about with the error than without it, but that doesn't count for much because they can all be traced back to hers. So here we have the family thing. They all have the same kind of thing, but that it's wrong. It's kind of sad when you think about it. That branch of the family has been eating pasty pastry all these years, thinking they were eating grandmother's finest. Marie's family also made copies, and somewhere along the line, they made a slip too. To my mind, this one improves the flavor of the pie. It happened like this. Grandmother's recipe for peach pie was just like the one for apple pie, except that it called for peaches instead of apples and nutmeg instead of cinnamon. Marie's copy water spotted in the ingredients section, so she wrote in what she remembered. Problem was, she remembered the peach recipe and wrote nutmeg instead of cinnamon. One of Marie's nieces noticed that there were two versions about, and rather than omit an essential ingredient, she included them both. The shortest reading is preferred. The result is absolutely heavenly. The only difficulty is that the only copies with both cinnamon and nutmeg are in Marie's branch of the family. I've come to call those folks the nutmeg and cinnamon cousins. They seem to be a rascally lot too. One of them wouldn't talk to me because she said I had abandoned the family heritage and didn't have the right to call myself a grandson at all. She seemed to reason that the best tasting version of the pie should automatically be considered grandmother's. I think that kind of reasoning is half-baked. It's just a tad dangerous to make that decision on the basis of taste. Tastes change, and they differ from one branch of the family to another. In fact, one could almost argue that the opposite rule ought to be the case. If people experimented a bit along the way and came up with a crust that was flakier or a filling that was richer, it's hard to believe they continue using the older, blander recipe. Every time a modification is made, the recipe is improved a bit. The movement would hardly go in the opposite direction. So the sheer deliciousness of the nutmeg and cinnamon recipe tells against it here. So here we have the hardest reading is generally preferred. By comparing Marie's copy with Joyce's and mine, I think I've been able to reconstruct grandmother's recipe with a fair amount of accuracy. It's a shame the original was lost, but no matter. We don't have grandmother's handwriting, but we do have her pie, and that's as good as it always was. Your loving nephew, Jerry Camry Hoggett. So does that help in illustrating how we could use textual criticism? I hope it does. I thought it was rather clever that he would write that up and give an example of how we may use textual criticism today, the way we would use it looking at the manuscripts of the Old Testament. All right. Recently, in recent years, a new method of doing textual criticism has developed called coherence-based genealogical method. It's quite technical, and it relies on computers to determine the best readings. The 28th edition of the Nestle Aland New Testament and the 5th edition of the UBS use it in the general epistles. Now let's look at the New Testament and the printing press. In the 15th century, Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press and revolutionized the world. Excuse me. Now, his real name was Johannes Gainsfleisch, which means Johnny Gooseflesh, but he changed it to his mother's maiden name. In 1450 to 56, the first Latin Bible was printed. And in 1488, the first Hebrew Bible was printed. Now, this was a revolutionary change because no longer did they have to use handwritten manuscripts. This was the movable type printing press. In 1516, the first Greek New Testament was printed in printed form was published by Erasmus. Now, in 1514, the Catholic cardinal printed a Greek New Testament, but he didn't have permission to publish it until 1520. So the Catholics actually had printed the first Greek New Testament, but Erasmus was the first to publish it in 1516. Erasmus primarily used two 12th century Greek manuscripts, which contained all of the New Testament except for the last 6 verses of Revelation. So Erasmus translated them from Latin into Greek. He put out another edition in March of 1515 and in April 1516. In 1519, he put out a new edition and several editions there until 1535. Now, like I said, one person accused Erasmus of leaving out 1 John 5:7, which says there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the New Testament. And like I said, he said, if you show me a Greek manuscript that has that, I will include it. And they did. And they probably made it for this occasion. It was manuscript 61 from the 16th century. And so he included it, and it found its way into what we call the Textus Receptus, upon which the King James was translated. Now, since that time, there have been great strides in the science of textual criticism. Here is the way that 1 Corinthians 1:1-3 looks in Codex Alexandrinus. Now, notice how all of the letters, all the words are just crunched together. There's no spacing between words. Excuse me. There's very little in the way of punctuation. Here is the way that it looks in the United Bible Society's New Testament. So you can see it's much easier to read in this modern version of the New Testament than in the original manuscript. This is the way the whole page of 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 1 down to verse 9 looks in the UBS New Testament. Notice that on the bottom half there, we have what we call the apparatus, which deals with textual variants in the text. And here is a copy of the apparatus there in the UBS Greek New Testament. Look at the left side. It has 1, which says this is variant 1, and then a larger one, which means verse 1, and then a B, which means that if it's A, it's very clear as to what the correct reading is. If it's B, there may be some doubt, and if it's C, there's a lot of doubt about it. The original reading, according to those who put this together, is Christou Jesu, Christ Jesus. If you go down to the second line, over toward the right, you'll see 2 lines, and you'll see there it reads Jesu Christou, Jesus Christ. So which is the original? Well, you have the evidence here after Christou Jesu on the top line, you have P46, and then the uncials, and then other versions and church fathers. If you go down to Jesu Christou, you have some uncials there, and then other ones. So there is some doubt here, a little bit of doubt about whether it said Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ. Now, here again, we have the Nestle Greek of the same. You can see that it, again, is a lot easier to read. And this is the way a page looks in the Nestle Allen Greek New Testament. In the left column, these are other verses that apply, that have parallels, or you might want to look up, cross-references, we call them. And then at the bottom is again, the apparatus. And here is a close-up of the apparatus in the Nestle Allen Greek New Testament. This is much more difficult to use because you have to learn the code. They use squiggly lines, circles, things that look like T's, and those all have meaning, but you have to learn what those things mean. It's called the sigla. A lot of textual critics, scholars prefer this over the UBS Greek New Testament. It's good to have both. So here's a comparison of the two different ones on 1 Corinthians 1:1. Okay. Here are the critical signs. We call this the sigla for Nestle 28th edition of the Greek New Testament. And you can see that, you have to learn the code there. Choosing a version of the Bible, okay? If we're going to choose a version, we want to choose a version that uses the older and better manuscripts. We want to choose a version that accurately translates the Greek text. And we want to choose a version that effectively communicates in today's language. And the King James would not be your preferred version on this criteria, because it uses later manuscripts. It's pretty accurate, I believe, in translating the manuscripts that it does use, but it no longer is effective in translating our in our kind of English that we speak today. So in choosing a text, I would go by those guidelines. Okay, do you have any questions or comments here? I've been giving you a lot of information here.
Sir, question.
Yes.
Oh.
Yes, Franz?
Going back to the changes, the unintentional, intentional, how can this be reconciled with the inerrancy and infallibility of Scripture?
We believe that the Scriptures were inerrant in the original autographs. So that doesn't mean that they were inerrantly transmitted from scribe to scribe. In the autographs, they are infallible, they are authoritative, they are inspired. And if you look at many of the pronouncements about what we believe about inspiration, it goes back to the autographs. Okay, it's the autographs that are inspired, what originally came from the pen of the author.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, God leaves it up to us to do the hard work of textual criticism. Any other questions or comments? All right, we will stop here and we will see you on Wednesday. Have a wonderful weekend and God bless you.
Same to you, Dr. Gaylor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gaylor.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
God bless you.